Welcome to Education Matters, presented by the Public School Forum of North Carolina. I'm your host, Marianne Wolf. Many of you are well aware of the state assessments that students in North Carolina take each year and the accountability system that assigns a letter grade to each traditional public school in our state. The assessment and accountability systems play a critical role in our students' educational experiences, opportunities, and outcomes. Today, we will dive into these important subjects and what lies ahead with guests from the State Board of Education, the North Carolina School Boards Association, and Caldwell County Schools. I'd like to welcome to the show Deanna Townsend-Smith, the Director of Board Operations and Policy for the North Carolina State Board of Education. Deanna, it is wonderful to have you with us today.
Marianne, thank you so much for extending this opportunity to engage in this most important conversation with you.
We often talk about assessment and accountability together, but they are in fact distinct in what they mean and their purposes. Would you please share more about how you view assessment and accountability?
Often the discussion of testing and accountability is lumped into one, and there are distinct differences. In my view, assessment is the process used to provide information on what students know. Accountability uses tests and scores from those assessments to determine effectiveness of teachers and schools. And it is ultimately one of the ways to determine meeting the expectations of a sound basic education, which is our constitutional responsibility. To ensure that we are meeting the needs of each and every student academically, testing is a key lever to ensuring equity.
We know the federal and state government have significant roles in accountability and assessment. Would you share more about how they shape our systems and even what students, families, and teachers experience every year?
As you know, in 2015, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was revamped, resulting in the Every Student Succeeds Act, which we refer to ESSA, which provided states with the flexibility and responsibility to design their state education accountability systems to meet current challenges. ESSA establishes for all states the minimum requirements for state accountability systems, and then states can set additional thresholds for student achievement. ESSA requires the substantial weight of our accountability model to be based on achievements of the required reading and math assessments, to administer tests that measure the breadth and depth of the state adopted content standards in reading and math in grades grade through 5 in high school, and then science in grades 5 and 8. In 2013, our General Assembly created school performance grades that assign schools a single letter grade, A through F. School letter grades are based on a combination of achievement and growth scores. In most cases, the current overall grade assigned to a school represents the growth score weighted at 20% and the achievement score weighted at 80% to render a score of a total of 100. In my opinion, the school performance grades are very simplistic and do not best capture a school's strengths and weaknesses.
As we begin our transition and recovery from COVID-19, which is obviously at the forefront of everyone's mind, how should we look at accountability moving forward?
I think COVID has provided an opportunity in a number of different areas, but specifically accountability. As we begin to recover from COVID-19, we should use this as an opportunity to improve our accountability system so that it is more holistic with more of an emphasis on growth. Our accountability system should not only include academic measures, but non-academic measures. We should use this time to develop and align visions and goals across all federal plans, together with ESSA, such as our Perkins 5, WIOA, which is known as the Workforce Innovation Act of 2014, so that we are all aiming at the same target to achieve greater impact with student experiences as they move through the system. Ultimately, the system should include multiple measures which provide necessary information on a student's preparedness for higher education, robust civic preparedness, and the workforce. The system should and must communicate that we are meeting student academic and non academic needs, preparing them for whatever path they choose, once they fully matriculate through our K-12 system.
Our State Board of Education and Department of Public Instruction recently created an Office of Equity. How does equity play a role in our accountability and assessment systems?
In 2019, the State Board of Education adopted a definition of equity for the state, and it settled on the definition being the belief and practice of ensuring that every student is treated in a fair and just manner, providing the necessary allocation of resources for the success of every student, and eliminating discriminatory barriers to full participation and opportunities for every student. Our accountability and assessment system should provide us with the necessary information to determine what students know and information on what barriers are hindering their success. Once we see those barriers, we should eliminate those gaps and expand the opportunity and access to each and every student. The Office of Equity will further this work across the state and develop recommendations for the State Board of Education to consider to remove barriers that impede equity.
How do you anticipate the Leandro plan affecting our work in the coming year?
If you recall, when the state board started its earlier work with the ESSA plan, we wanted to have a more holistic system of accountability, and I think that this provides us an opportunity to ensure those multiple measures are included in partnership with our General Assembly and other partners to make sure that we have a system that values growth more, that we ensure pre-K to 3 readiness, that we make sure that students are college and career ready, and that we have some measures in there to ensure school quality to meet like the equity and whole child needs for every student.
Our accountability and assessment systems affect many people across the state, and they also have a profound impact on how we prioritize certain aspects of school and learning opportunities every single day in our schools, quite frankly. Whose voices should we include in this discussion about rethinking our current systems?
I think that this is at the heart of equity, right? Whose voice should we include? And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, each and every voice matters. Accountability and assessment systems affect and inform many decisions. We must include all voices, be that policymakers, thought leaders, practitioners, community groups, civic organizations, families, and most importantly, students, as we rethink our current systems. When we do this, we build urgency and collective will, addressing the needs of each and every child, embracing the guiding priorities that have been established for this state, which are equity and whole child.
Thank you so much for being here, Deanna. After the break, we will be joined by Don Phipps, the Superintendent of Caldwell County Schools, and Leanne Winner, the Executive Director of the North Carolina School Boards Association.
Education Matters is brought to you each week in part by Town Bank, serving others, enriching lives.
Joining us now are Dr. Don Phipps, the Superintendent of Caldwell County Schools, and Leanne Winner, the Executive Director for the North Carolina School Boards Association. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Will you please share more about our current assessments and accountability model and how it affects your schools and students?
It's a big question and something that we're really looking at, and we hope to see some reform initiatives that happen in the years to come. We know that's a big undertaking and a big task, but when you look at the assessment and accountability, I think one of the big pieces is you have to decouple, as we've heard earlier in the program, of what exactly assessment and accountability are. But the impacts are felt by students, they're felt by our parents, our teachers, our principals. There are wages that are tied to outcomes. Decisions are made on whether or not students are promoted or not. And the concern that I have about the accountability and assessment models that we have are that a student's career for that year, the historical perspective for that year, are based on what happens on a single day in the life of a child on a single test. And it's troubling because I don't feel like it shows a clear picture, but there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a great deal of angst that individuals have when it comes up to testing season. And I wish that we had a more authentic way to measure what students have learned throughout the school year that has multiple measures. So we have what we have in place. We've worked with that, but I think it's time, and there are several groups that are working right now to look at putting ideas on the table. And I hope some of those come to fruition in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Don, for outlining that. And Leanne, as you work with schools districts across our state, what are the challenges, but maybe also opportunities you see with the North Carolina assessments and the accountability model?
It's really important that we define what it is we're trying to do with the accountability system. We've really lost that through the years, if it ever really was defined. What is the purpose? We've put layer upon layer on top of what we're using it for, to where it feels very punitive to school districts and to staff across the state. Are we using it primarily as a way to pay people? I mean, that is obviously a goal that it could be, but that was not the original goal, and it's not really set up to do that in an effective manner. So I think the state really needs to come up with what the purpose is first. And then once we know the purpose, I think we can come up with a meaningful measure. And then it will need to be rolled out, and people will need to understand what that is.
We definitely want to talk today a little bit about where we go longer term, but I also know that right now we're in this hopefully transition and recovery from COVID-19. And I'd love to hear just a little bit more, Leanne, about how should we look at this year and maybe even next year? What do we need to happen immediately as then we work on this longer term plan?
I think that everyone realizes there has been substantial learning loss, or not as much gain as we would see in a typical school year across the state. And so we really need to make sure that for this year and probably the next few years, that this is not viewed as something that is punitive. That we really need to find out where these kids are as they're coming back into school and getting ready for next school year. And how do we bridge if you have a student who was at grade level and now is not at grade level? How do we bridge that without labeling them and doing long-term permanent damage to their learning journey?
Don, as we shift a little bit to thinking obviously now, but also into the future, I think it's important to reference that our state accountability model has designated schools with letter grades for many years. How do they affect your schools in your district, and how well do they depict the learning opportunities and outcomes that are happening there?
It's a great question. It has a great impact on us. And I think I go back 15 years or so ago, 20 years ago, when I was a principal in Cumberland County. And I started to realize when I grew up, I was in a military family. My family landed where they landed, and we went to school wherever that school was. And what I realized as I became a principal is that we had many parents who were interviewing and going out and examining schools and school districts to determine where they wanted their students to be. And when you have a letter grade that depicts quality in the minds of those who are viewing that, they take it for what it is. And my concern is that when we look at the letter grades in North Carolina, and I went back and looked at research back to 17, 18, there were 0 F schools. When you look at the poverty ratings of schools, it's a remarkable number of how many of our low wealth schools or our schools that have poverty ratings of 50% or greater. There are very few of them represented in the letter A, and they're almost all represented in the letter F. And when I look at that, it's a proxy measure of poverty in our school system. And it goes back to the Leandro conversation and what school districts are able to do. There are so many other indicators. As I am in and out of schools on a regular basis, I know what's going on in our buildings. And to simply reflect a letter grade based on test scores or a few other indicators is just not comprehensive enough. And we have met and we've talked about that. And I do hope that's an area for reform to give a better, more comprehensive picture. Again, I want to restate that when we say that a school or a student or a teacher or a principal's year is going to be marked by what happens on a single test score on a single day is just not good enough. We need to have a better measure that's more comprehensive, that shows work that's been done throughout the school year. And for schools, that can be many indicators that are academic. It can also deal with social and emotional needs that exist within our schools, which is a great need in public education right now and across the society for that matter. But graduation rates and what are we doing with our pathways at high school for career and college and promise, and the credentials that can be earned. There are just lots of indicators that can be put in to make a better picture, a clearer picture that's more descriptive and a better example of what's really going on inside of a building. And we want parents to know that. We want them to have the really true comprehensive picture based on what they're looking at. And I think that if we can reform those letter grades, none of us are afraid of accountability. We want to be held accountable. I think many of us would say we want that opportunity to showcase the great work that's gone on in our schools by our teachers and our students, but we want it to be fair and we want it to be comprehensive.
As you work across our state with all the different districts, do you see very similar requests, and are there any additional indicators you might add to that list that Dawn has shared?
There was a proposal a few years ago through a pilot project to do measures 4 times during the year. And there appeared to be, I would say, some backlash from folks that essentially now you are making it for many EOGs, and that was going to put too much stress on teachers and too much stress on students. But then folks don't like it's one day. And so I'm not quite sure where that balance comes between spreading it out throughout the course of the year or having it one day. And I think we may just have to make a decision and decide, okay, we're going to do it this way. And there was some pressure from teachers that it was going to make it so that they did not have as much flexibility about when they taught things. So, I mean, it was a pretty robust discussion a couple of years ago, and a few districts moved into a pilot project, and then it seems to have never come to fruition. As far as other measures, I think there is still a big debate over the actual tests themselves and whether the questions and how many questions there should be. Obviously, there needs to be enough questions that you can have the statistical measures correctly for it. But I think that is something that still needs to be talked about as we move through this process.
One of the things I know you all have also talked about is this designation of low performing schools and how it affects not only students, as Dawn talked about, but also the communities in which our schools operate. And I wonder if you'd like to share a little bit about that as well.
So the current definition of a low performing school is if you are a D or an F school for it's a certain number of years, and you either did not meet growth or you met growth. And so the debate, at least the last few years, has been whether that met growth should be considered or not. And we have proposed bills as an organization to the General Assembly, which have passed the House, but not passed the Senate, to remove from that definition met growth. Because if you've met growth, you're doing what you're supposed to do for that school year. You have overall met a year's worth of growth for the students in your school. They just started out behind based on the grade of the D or the F. But there has not seemed to have been much appetite for that on the Senate side. And so we believe as part of this whole package, that definition needs to be looked at as well. It is a label, and it sends a message in communities. And again, there is a high correlation between those schools that are considered low performing and poverty.
Dawn, as we wrap up here, something I'd love to ask you is, there's clearly interest in moving forward and thinking differently about our assessment system, but also our accountability system. And who do you think should be at the table as we go forward, thinking about your own district and your experience to make sure that we actually design, as you said, authentic opportunities to both assess, but also have an accountability system that really measures what we're looking for?
As we define those two terms, and we think about how we operationalize those in our daily work, the answer would be that we need to have a voice from everyone, and we can't bring everybody to the table, but certainly our business community. We all are working with business partners now on business advisory councils that exist in all of our school districts, but we have so many stakeholders and stakeholder groups that we need to hear their feedback because their perspectives are all a little different. And some are using the outcomes of these tests and our accountability measures in different ways. And I think we need to understand that, and we need to understand the impact that it has. And there may be some things that we're not assessing or data that needs to be collected that we need to. I'm aware that there are different guidelines. The federal government has certain guidelines and the state has certain guidelines, and sometimes those are different. And some of our models may not work with one and may work with another. So we have to figure out how to balance that and calibrate the work that's being done. But yeah, I think about the folks that I have the pleasure to interact with in our community on a regular basis. And I certainly would want to have their voices at the table. And in some cases, these may be individuals that you normally don't think about in an educational environment, but they are stakeholders because they may be working with our graduates when they graduate. They may be concerned about the content or the academic content and the classes that are being taken, what our curriculum looks like. All of those things are pieces that play in to the overall big picture of what happens in our schools.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. We clearly have a lot of work to do, but I really appreciate your voices and all of your thoughts, and also just elevating what we need to do for our students. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After the break, this week's final word. North Carolina's assessment and accountability systems play a critical role in what happens in our schools during the entire school year. What we as a state measure, how we measure it, and even when we measure indicates what we see as academically important and affects how we use our time and resources in our schools. Strong assessment and accountability systems are important so that we can understand where our students are and ensure that all students have access to a sound basic education. However, our current systems may not lead to the learning opportunities and instructional experiences research demonstrates to be most effective. And North Carolina's measures may tell us more about the socioeconomic status of our students' families or zip codes than the progress our students are making. We have many scenarios where the rigidity of our assessment system and accountability system drive what opportunities are available for our students. For example, the fact that end of grade and end of course assessments are only available at very limited times of the year implies and often drives the concepts that all students should be progressing at the same pace to take the one-day measure on a given day. This affects how schools view the viability of competency-based approaches, meeting individual needs, interests, and strengths, and shifting schedules and other structures within a school. North Carolina is at an important juncture in how we approach assessment and accountability for our students. Research shows us that the most effective assessment and accountability systems for our students reliably assess multiple measures of student performance and provide accountability for those measures. To move toward this goal, North Carolina has a solid blueprint to follow in the Leandro 8-year comprehensive remedial plan recently submitted to the court. Assessment should inform instruction and provide data and information that helps our education systems, schools, teachers, families, and students more effectively meet the needs of individuals. This is assessment for learning rather than simply assessment of learning. If a teacher or a student is not able to learn from the assessment, and if the assessment does not inform the learning experience of the student, it is not for learning. Accountability is important to ensure that every student in our state has access to a sound basic education and that factors including zip code, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or existence of a disability do not determine the educational outcomes of our students. Our accountability system should provide us with the data and information that we need to ensure that our schools meet the needs of every student and that our students have access to equitable education and learning opportunities. Thank you for taking time with us to learn and think about education. That's all for today, and we'll see you next week.